Good evening, you're watching Asian Review and I'm David Day. This evening we have a very special program with a group of experts. We're going to be talking about the reawakening of Japanese nationalism. And to help us with this discussion, let me introduce our distinguished group that we have in the studio with us here. Next to me is Jeffrey Hornick, and Jeffrey is a Associate Professor with the Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies, and he is also a Fellow in the Office of the Japan Chair of the Center for International Strategic Studies in Washington, D.C. Did I get that?
Yes.
Partially right? Yes. Okay. That's a title. That's a title. And next to Jeffrey is Professor Yoichiro Sato from Reitz-Mekon University.
Asia Pacific
in Japan.
University.
He's come all the way from Japan. Did I get that correct now?
Yeah.
Help me with the...
Yeah, Reawakening Asia Pacific University.
Oh, there's a Pacific in there.
Yeah, Asia Pacific.
Reitz-Mekon Pacific University.
Asia Pacific.
Asia Pacific University. I don't know why I'm having a hard time with that. Okay. And then next to Professor Sato, we have David Foust, who is also an associate professor with the Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies here in Honolulu. And David's area of specialty is in regional security and special emphasis on Japan, something like that. Okay. And so, ladies and gentlemen, by way of background for this program, all of you know that Japan has suffered a nearly a two-generation economic malaise of lost generations, coupled with the collapse of their demographics, and also the horrendous Tohoku Fukushima disaster. And at the same time that the country has suffered these difficulties, we have seen, we believe, a rise of Japanese nationalism. And we want to delve into some questions about how this came about, what it means, and the ramifications of this during the course of this program. And so let me start out, first of all, with kind of defining our terms a little bit here. We see in the media, gentlemen, frequently the use of the word nationalism. And I suppose from the Japanese perspective, there's nationalism, but maybe it's to use the English word, somewhat like patriotism. I guess what I'm getting at is, do you feel that in some quarters outside of Japan, when the term nationalism is used, that it's a negative thing, negative inference? It's not a positive patriotism, support the country type of thing. What do you think? David?
Yeah, I think when people are referencing Japanese nationalism in the contemporary period, they're usually trying to harken back to the pre-war days of a nationalism that was tainted with fascism, that was heavily repressive of the population and their rights and freedoms, and that helped to bring about the wars in the Pacific. What I think is going on today, in my view, which is based on research and reading of others, is that you have very strong nationalism in Japan today in the public, but it's more of a cultural nationalism, a socio-cultural nationalism that is pride in the culture, history, the geography of Japan, and their various cultural attributes. This is something that the conservative leadership in Japan today is trying to reconnect with the state, because after the end of World War II, there was pretty much a kind of disconnect between that cultural pride that Japanese have always had and the attachment to the state, which they had in the pre-war period. This is what the right wing is trying to reconnect now.
Okay. Yoichiro, you have a different slant on this?
No, I think I mostly agree with Dave that the strong support for the pre-war style militarism is not part of whatever you might think is nationalism today. And Japan's, even for the cultural aspect of nationalism, I think Japan has very successfully maintained a lot of long historical attributes, and I think it's only natural that most Japanese continue to be proud of it.
David, what's the difference in your view of we as Americans we talk about being an American patriot or patriotic towards the country, and this whole concept of Japanese nationalism that we've been talking about, is it the same thing?
Wait, just be clear, this is Jeff.
Yeah, well, I mean, when I look, the nationalism, the term nationalism that, as you referred to, it is used a lot in the media, but I think it's a very broad brush that gets painted. Sort of picking up to David's point and to answer your question, there's a civic nationalism and there's an ethno-nationalism, or the ethno-nationalism more prioritizes the ethnicity, the one's race, whereas there's a civic nationalism that celebrates more the institutions, one state's achievements, culture side, and I think that's the side that gets promoted more. And in that regards, maybe you could say that it's similar to the U.S. patriotism. I think that's where the similarity lies, because it's more of promotion of this is what our country, what we're proud of, we're celebrating this, we're promoting this. But when it does come to nationalism and a lot of this negative imagery that gets promoted in the media, a lot of it comes down to painting the nationalism of we versus an other, and that somehow the Japanese nationalism that's around today is targeting China or targeting Korea, and so that's where you get a lot of this pre-war negativity that the media paints.
Okay, is it true, gentlemen, that if we step back, that there has been a change, a rise, that there's been a reawakening of nationalism in Japan? David?
Just to kind of continue with this definition of nationalism and try to answer your question, I believe Professor Soya of Keio University talked a while ago about 3 different kinds of nationalism in Japan. One being a kind of a progressive nationalism, came out of the early post-war period. Another being kind of a moderate, and then another being kind of an assertive. And I think we do have an assertive nationalist agenda that you see with the current leadership that has been with the LDP, and what they're trying to do is to get the population a little more on board. However, the population is more in that moderate nationalist sphere.
What do you mean by the word assertive?
Well, I think,
how assertive are you? What are you talking about here?
I think their main project is self-determination. Self-determination is the main goal of the assertive nationalists right now, and that's basically kind of taking back control over foreign policy, over their security policy, things that they gave up at the end of World War II, becoming kind of a patron of the United States.
So you're saying that there is, the assertion is going back to the time when they gave up stuff.
Yes.
And it is a part of that assertiveness, is that due to a falling back of the U.S. in the region, a weakening perception of a weakening, declining U.S. in the region?
Okay.
Jeff?
I mean, the way that I would answer this is that, the question, your previous question, this one is sort of what's given, is this new or is this something that's something new? I would say 2 things. First, I would differentiate between nationalism in Japan writ large versus this administration. And I would say that it's more in this administration. I don't think that it's more in the population writ large. The second point is what's happening now. If you look at this administration, the roots of this of Prime Minister Abe and the people around him is it within a faction of the LDP that traces its way back to the Fukuda, and then earlier than that, which is the 1970s Prime Minister, Fukuda. And this is very much a close to the U.S., but more of trying to regain some of the sovereignty, as David was referring to, trying to rewrite and gain more of its own independence. And so you have this has been around for a long time, but the difference right now is that the liberal factions that used to hold this faction in check within the LDP has weakened, died away, and so you have within the LDP now no break factionally on this group of politicians.
Okay.
Could I jump on board?
Short answer, though.
A short answer being, I think that the current administration is kind of the far end of the spectrum, but I wouldn't want to separate what they're doing from the Liberal Democratic Party's long-term post-war project to kind of redeem the earlier era. The LDP has been working at doing that throughout the post-war period and building up national pride and kind of recovering the pride that they had in Japan. And this has been going on throughout the post-war period. And in some respects, the United States has helped in doing that because we supported the LDP in the early post-war period. But you can go back, Obuchi in 1999, reinstating Kimigayo as the national anthem and the flag. There's been a long-term post-war project that Abe is part of, and so I would hesitate to completely separate him from that post-war project.
Let me
Yuichiro.
in this discussion, yeah. Now, I think this is important that, a lot of Western media have already painted Abe as an ultra-nationalist and equated that with Japan as a whole. And I think I said that in Washington, D.C., that that's an overly generalized view and probably inaccurate as well. And I'm having a hard time figuring out who Prime Minister Abe actually is. Is he a far-right person, or is he kind of a moderate conservative person acting as a far-right person? I cannot make that distinction because I'm not Abe and I cannot get into his head. And however, the difference is very important because, as Dave pointed out, if Japan is heading toward a more autonomous, foreign policy and defense posture, away from the U.S.-Japan alliance, that's something the U.S. might be concerned about. Although the U.S. has encouraged Japan to, build up its military and, take more active international security roles, the U.S. wants Japan to act side by side or in an integrated fashion with the U.S. forces. So if that's not what Japan is heading for, then the U.S. might be concerned. And my thinking is that because Japan has been put on the far left in the immediate post-war period by the New Deal liberals in the occupation group, what Abe is trying to do is he stand on the far right and bring whole of Japan toward the center.
Okay, with that thought, we will pick up after the break, and we'll talk about where are we seeing this rise or reawakening of Japan's new nationalism? Where are we seeing it manifested? And we'll see you on the other side of the break. You're watching Asian Review, and I'm David Day.
Castle and Cook, Hawaii. Investing in Hawaii, creating communities, and providing for the needs of our state. Collateral Analytics, empowering the real estate industry to make better informed property investment decisions. The Foreign Trade Zone, bringing the benefits of the Foreign Trade Zone programs to Hawaii businesses and entrepreneurs. Galen Ho, a senior executive of BAE Systems, a global defense, security, and aerospace company. Hawaiian Electric Company and its affiliates Maui Electric and Hawaii Electric Light Company on Hawaii Island. The Hawaii Energy Policy Forum, incorporating diverse perspectives to design a flexible and forward-looking energy strategy. Hawaii Energy, the state's energy and efficiency program created to help Hawaii's residents and businesses adopt a clean energy lifestyle. Hawaii Gas, helping Hawaii achieve its transition to clean energy and a better energy future. Hawaii Pacific Health, bringing technology and teamwork together to transform healthcare in Hawaii. The High Tech Development Corporation, attached to DBED, is the state's leading technology agency. The Scheidler Family Foundation, supporting educational, cultural, and charitable organizations, including ThinkTech.
We're back. You're watching Asian Review, and I'm David Day. We're here with three experts on regional security and Japan, focusing on the reawakening of Japan's nationalism. We've got Jeffrey Horning. We also have Professor Yoichiro Sato from Japan and David Foust. David and Jeffrey are both from the Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies, and Yoichiro is from Ritsumeikan Asia Pacific University in Beppu, Japan.
Yep.
Got it right, finally. And no, I'm not going to tell you about Jeffrey Horning's title like that. It's too long. But right before the break, if you were with us, we were talking about the why or how this concept of nationalism or Japanese pride, patriotism has come about. And so what we want to do in this segment of the program is kind of look at what are some of the ways that we would see this from the outside. How is this manifested? And Yoichiro, you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah. Well, most recently, Prime Minister Abe's visit to the Yasukuni Shrine.
Okay, hold one second, Mr. Producer. If you could put up photograph number one. Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
So this is a picture. This is what we're looking at here.
And oftentimes this is treated as if the evidence of reassertive Japan and Japan's nationalism, but the truth is that Abe is not the first prime minister to visit the Yasukuni Shrine, and many prime minister, throughout pretty much the entire post-World War II period, have visited Yasukuni Shrine. And when Prime Minister Nakasone visited in 1985, it became kind of a big issue, and since then the Prime Minister's visit to the shrine became controversial.
Why is this a big issue for non-Japanese outside the country?
Well,
or is it only for people in 2 or 3 handful of countries?
Well, for the Chinese and Koreans, most frequently cited argument is that the Class A war criminals are enshrined at the Yasukuni Shrine, but although some pointed out that the Class B and Class C war criminals are also there, which is a truth. But when it became a problem, and my answer is that it became a problem because of the changing international relations context in Northeast Asia.
Okay. What is, Yoichiro, if I was an American Indian and Jeffrey here was a president of the United States, and Jeffrey decided that he was going to go to Arlington Cemetery. And it was my position that Arlington Cemetery has, beneath its hallowed ground, buried some, from my perspective as an American Indian, some war criminals, American war criminals. Is that kind of the parallel that's here?
I think that one of the difference is that Arlington is not specifically affiliated with any particular religion, whereas Yasukuni is clearly a Shinto shrine, and this puts Yasukuni to a criticism that Prime Minister is violating the constitutional separation of church and state, which is one line of opposition against the Prime Minister's visit to the Yasukuni.
David, within Japan, when Abe made this trip to Yasukuni, was the population at large bothered by this? Are they offended? Are they ticked off? Or do they just, so he visited the Yasukuni Shrine. What else?
Well, I think the original public opinion polls showed a basic split in the population about him going to the shrine. However, more recent polling on the impact that visit is having on the relations with China and with South Korea and others shows that a vast majority of Japanese are concerned about the problems that that visit has caused. And I think that's really the crux of the issue with the Yasukuni Shrine visits is, does Prime Minister Abe have the right to visit the shrine in his own country? Of course he does. But does Prime Minister Abe have to be concerned with the impact that that visit is going to have on Japan's relations with other countries in Asia? And by the way, the U.S. has a tight relationship with Japan and an alliance, and when the U.S. sees that Japan is isolating itself from other countries in Asia, that impacts our relations as well. So we have an interest in that, and I believe that's why the U.S. has voiced some disappointment over that visit.
Aside from the relationships between Japan and Korea, Japan and China, and attempts within our own State Department to restrain the senior leadership in Japan from
Vice President Biden
from visiting the Yasukuni Shrine. Are there ramifications in other quarters globally, or have I identified all the complainers?
Well, I think it wasn't just the traditional China-South Korea complaints that you heard after this visit. You also had complaints from different areas of Asia. I saw things in Taiwan, Singapore. I don't know. I think there were others. The complaints are not just. I don't completely agree with you that it's just about a shift in international relations, because there was a shift in the shrine itself that occurred after. Well, the scholarship on this, there's a debate, but a lot of people have argued that there was a shift to bring the war criminals into Yasukuni Shrine, that the government was involved in that, and that this led to the raising of other countries' concerns about when a visit to the Yasukuni Shrine.
The 1978 edition of the Class A war criminals was one of the reasons why the shrine issue became more controversial than before. But Class B and Class C are more numerous, and they were added to the shrine earlier in the 1950s. And at that time, prime ministers continued to visit the Yasukuni Shrine, and it was not an international issue. And one might even argue that before it became an international issue, it was a domestic issue inside Japan. And domestic liberals started complaining about it when the Class A war criminals were added. And then the Koreans and Chinese criticism escalated after the issue became a controversy inside Japan.
Okay, Jeffrey, let's move from this Yasukuni discussion to a more recent example that perhaps is evidence of the manifestation of a rising or reawakening nationalism in Japan, and that's the NHK executive who was, I guess, appointed to that position by Prime Minister Abe, and he gets in this position of head of Japan's most prestigious broadcasting system, really, and makes some statements. And so, for our audience, would you kind of bring them up to speed on what this problem is all about?
Yeah, well, essentially you have NHK, which is, I guess the best comparison would be like the BBC. It's a government, their broadcasting network. And you have, as you said, he's appointed by the administration. And he makes a comment regarding the Nanjing massacre. I actually think there were two comments. There was two comments,
one about Nanjing, one about comfort women.
Right. And there's concerns about.
Well, let's tell the audience what was the comment that he made about Nanjing.
The Nanjing comment had to do with that it didn't happen, and the comfort women was that the military brothels, all countries during World War II did military brothels, and that the Japanese government did not have a system, and they didn't particularly do anything bad. I believe I captured that.
Okay.
And so, and this riles a lot of countries, not just Korea and China, but it riles a lot of other countries, including scholars and administration officials in the U.S., because there is a broader consensus around that what the Japanese Imperial Army did in Nanjing, whether you call it a massacre, a rape, whatever you call it, a lot of civilians were killed. It doesn't matter, in my personal belief, it doesn't matter if it was 1 or 300,000. The fact is that civilians were targeted. And then you also have with the comfort women, which is a euphemism for sexual slavery, that the Japanese military basically it had
They perpetuated throughout Asia.
It wasn't just Koreans. It was predominantly Koreans, but you had Dutch in Indonesia. You had Australians. You had Chinese. You had a lot of women that were put into this, and so he was denying essentially Japanese involvement or Japanese or that this stuff took place. And so it does rile a lot of other countries who have a very different perception of history, a different understanding of history. And so the reason why this is controversial is this is a gentleman who's in charge of this broadcast, this network, who's supposed to be giving very neutral, non-politically biased news accounts, and his own personal views swept in. And gave this. Now, people called for his resignation. Abe did not come out to criticize and say that this was wrong. Essentially, it was just this is his political belief, or his personal belief.
All
I'm
right,
sorry.
but doesn't this whole NHK incident, doesn't it, from the outside of Japan, doesn't it hook in nicely with the understanding that in the post-war period, what Japan has attempted to do in educating its younger generation is to whitewash in the textbooks these types of terrible problems that we believe in fact occurred during World War II.
Right. I think it feeds.
It feeds
the
that.
optics are horrible because it feeds into the perception that the administration condones this because they didn't criticize it. It also feeds into the optics that this could be the public opinion that's broadcast to the whole people of Japan, and so it feeds into the public perception that this is rampant.
Right.
Along with Abe's plan to move the control over the textbooks down to a lower level, the mirror level, and so on, a lot of people are concerned that that's also going to lead to textbooks being whitewashed and kind of a conservative bias being pushed into the books as well.
Well, you know, we've just talked about these two examples, Yasukuni and the NHK situation, as a, you know, it's one thing that you can see probably on the, anyway you evaluate it, on the negative side of the manifestation of a reawakening of nationalism in Japan. But let's shift now from a talk about maybe where the leadership is and where they're going to what are the attitudes really in the people. What if we were to take their temperature? What would we find? And what I'd like you gentlemen to do is think about that, because we're going to go to a break now. And when we come back from the break, let's get into that and talk about what is the feeling of the people, really. You're watching Asia in Review. I'm David Day, and we'll be back right after the break.
Aloha, I'm Jay Fidel of
40
ThinkTech.
seconds.
We have some news for you. In addition to our ThinkTech TV show and our Asia in Review show on Olelo 54, as of January 1st, we're adding Community Matters to play also 2 hours a week. Check out ThinkTechHawaii.com for the specific times of each of these shows. We hope you enjoy all three. Mahalo, I'm Jay Fidel.
Aloha, I'm Maria Kashem of ThinkTech Hawaii, and I want to tell you about our ThinkTech talk shows. If you didn't know it, ThinkTech streams video and audio for all of its shows live on the internet from 2 to 5 p.m. every weekday afternoon, and we replay them all night long on Ustream.tv. Visit ThinkTechHawaii.com for our live stream and YouTube links. Raise your awareness on ThinkTech. I'm Maria Kashem, and I'll see you there.
We're back. You're watching Asian Review, and I'm David Day. Our program this evening is talking about the reawakening of Japanese nationalism, and we have with us three distinguished experts here. Mr. Jeffrey Hornig from the Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies, an associate professor there. Jeffrey also has a big fancy title as a fellow with the Office of Japan, or the Japan Chair. Help me with this.
Office of the Japan Chair at the Center for Strategic and International Studies.
You can imagine what that looks like on a business card. In the center of the group here, we have distinguished Professor Yoichiro Sato from Ritsumeikan Asia Pacific University in Beppu, Japan. And on the far side, another David Foust, who's an associate professor with the Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies. And David is also is a regional specialist in Northeast Asia with a concentration on Japan. Gentlemen, right before the break, we were talking about shifting now from trying to precisely pin where the Abe government is on the issue of nationalism, and at least we've established that that leadership is to the right of center. How far and why, we don't know, whether it's genuine or not, but at least they're there. So let me ask the question, what are the people really, the feelings of nationalism, have they really, patriotism, is it something if we were to go out and talk to the average person on the street, would we see this? Would they articulate it?
I don't see a strong change in degree of nationalism in Japan, and average people are just living just as they did before, and they're not paying particular attention to this sort of international issues. But on the other hand, the demonstrations in China, Korea, and all those pictures are available in newspapers, and some people started thinking, why are they so upset? And some of them, maybe shift toward the liberal side, and now we understand why they're upset. And others think that they're being upset without good reasons, and they might shift toward the right.
Are you saying that in the people, the nationalistic feelings, if they're there, have arisen as a reaction to anti-Japanese protests? And
that's my feeling. It's more reactive than proactive movement.
Same, David?
I agree, and I think this is something that the right knows and that they've played upon. I've seen Nakanishi and other writers in Japan who are of the far right perspective argue that we need more of these types of events to help trigger a stronger conservative movement inside of Japan.
What do you mean need more of these events? In China or Korea?
In China and Korea, when Prime Minister Abe goes to Yasukuni and you get this backlash, this
is a good thing?
Yeah, because the right wing was fairly small in Japan for quite a while, but when you have these events, the backlash splits the Japanese public. Some of them are taking a harder stance towards those countries, and it kind of fuels a growing conservative movement.
It pushes more political strength in the corral of the current leadership, if you will.
Well, what's happening is the far right benefits from polarization at the expense of the moderates. Far left cannot grow in Japan. Cold War's over, Soviet Union's gone. Far left cannot grow. But far right can grow at the expense of the moderates.
So what, are you just saying that the more that anti-Japanese demonstrations take place in Korea and in China, that the leadership is quietly applauding that, and if they look at the backlash from visit to Yasukuni, are you suggesting that there may be conversations quietly in the senior leadership that says, Prime Minister Abe, it's about time for you to make another visit to Yasukuni because it would help us? Is that what you're really saying?
Yeah.
Okay. Jeffrey, I know you're not trying to be silent here on this, but what's your take on this?
I mean, I disagree in some aspects because I knew, there is this split amongst the population, and there's a split also within the political elite. And so you talk to people in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, you talk to politicians, you talk to people in the Ministry of Defense, and as was said earlier, when things like the Yasukuni visit occurs and there's a backlash, a negative backlash, where there's complaints about these visits, you do have people in Japan in senior positions that worry about Japan's ability to take on leadership positions in Asia, leadership positions in international organizations, the closeness with the US, because
That's part of the backlash.
It's part of the backlash. Japanese legitimacy gets questioned. And so I don't agree necessarily with this idea that the administration's fully, applauding all these things that happen. But to go to the question you were asking about, the population, and David was answering about how a lot of this, the population, Japanese populist backlash usually follows events. There is data when you
hold one second.
Sure.
Hold that thought,
Sure.
Jeffrey. Mr. Producer, would you bring up photograph number 3, please? This is a picture, ladies and gentlemen, of an anti-Japanese protest taking place where, Yoichiro?
In China.
In China. So part of our discussion so far, Jeffrey, has been that these types of protests are fueling the backlash. Right.
I think that it does have effect. I just disagree with that the administration applauds this. But you do see
that was my word. Those were my words.
Right. But you do see there's polling data by the Cabinet Office that asks about people's affinity towards other countries, and you find that the affinity towards Korea, towards China, drops dramatically following events like Korea's President Lee, his visit to the disputed island, or the big protests in China. There's this massive drop that happens in those polls afterwards, which shows that there is a correlation that's happening with these things and Japanese views.
Yeah, I totally agree, but I still don't want to exaggerate that Japanese do react to overseas demonstrations. But here is an example. Right after this massive Chinese demonstration after the Prime Minister Noda nationalized the Senkaku Islands, I was in the Chinatown in Yokohama.
Okay.
And there are many, ethnic Chinese people living there, having restaurants, and no single broken glass in the entire Yokohama Chinatown. Japanese didn't react in a violent way at all to, that massive scale of demonstration in China. A lot of Japanese shops were destroyed, cars were destroyed.
Mr. Producer, would you put up photograph number 4, please? Yoichiro, why are we looking at this picture?
Yeah, if we are talking about the kind of reassertive Japanese nationalism trying to recover what Japan lost at the end of the World War II, then we have to revisit this question. Is Japanese nationalism also targeted at the United States? And that is a big question.
Or more broadly, we've just showed a picture of the explosion of the Arizona during Pearl Harbor, the sinking of the Arizona. Are we more broadly talking about a reassertion of Japanese nationalism in the form of an aggressive military?
Aggressive military?
I mean, does anybody seriously believe that the Japanese military is at some point in time going to pose a threat to the United States, like in 1941?
I don't.
No, you're not saying that.
No.
I mean, I'm wondering if the picture of Pearl Harbor is actually, do the Koreans or Chinese actually believe that Japan is becoming so assertive that it's going to attack them?
No, the significance of the Pearl Harbor event is in this broad movement about revision of the World War II history, which is oftentimes associated with the discussion of nationalism in Japan.
Okay.
And you talked about denial about Nanking massacre and comfort woman and things like that, and the Class A war criminal became an issue. Well, some of the Class A war criminals are root criminal because of their involvement in
World War II,
in starting the World War II.
Yeah.
And so if this kind of historical revision, which Class A was innocent, which Class A was guilty, and revisit the Tokyo war a criminal trial, then the U.S. gets dragged into this discussion about history.
Okay, and let's go, Mr. Producer, to photograph number 2, if we could, which is a picture of the Senkaku Islands. And we are not going to take a lot of time to discuss that dispute, but my question to you 3 gentlemen is, are we going to see this toe-to-toe confrontation between China and Japan go on for a while, or is there a solution to this on the horizon?
Let's say they're pretty dug in on both sides.
Okay.
I don't think it's going anywhere. You know, I don't think either country is looking to get into an all-out war over it. They both see the consequences are huge, but that doesn't prevent an accident or, you know, some type of event that could lead to larger scale war.
Mr. Producer, let's go to photograph number 6, if we could. So, ladies and gentlemen, this is a overlay map of the East China Sea Air Defense Identification Zone that was recently imposed by China over the Senkaku Islands. You see, gentlemen, you see an opportunity that this might be removed. Or is this an example of a hardening?
Which one?
Good point. That's right, because there is an overlap there. David, you want to explain that to our audience?
Well, the United States and Japan have both had air defense identification zones in place for, 30, 40 years. And China recently imposed its own air defense identification zone, overlapping with the Japanese there. And I think with one difference from the way that the U.S. and Japan and some other countries had imposed theirs, that being that planes flying through there needed to give notification to the Chinese government, regardless of whether they intended to actually
approach the land.
Yes.
Okay.
And so that's a new spin on these ADIZs, and it's something that concerned the United States and other countries.
But I think even on that point, though, I think it's often not stated, though. China's not the only country that does that. The Philippines, their ADIZ, you have to do
fly through,
and Taiwan also has the same rule.
Okay.
No, I think it has a very clever political purpose. And
what's that?
Well, it forces the U.S. overflight through the zone, and a lot of U.S. carriers have stopover in Tokyo and flying to Southeast Asia, and those planes are not heading into China, but they're required to report their flight plan with the Chinese authority, and this created a split between the Japanese government, which told the domestic carriers not to abide by the Chinese request, and American State Department, which told the domestic carriers it's okay to comply.
Yeah.
So, and China clearly intended creating that kind of, image of divergence, and that's a minor gain for China.
Mr. Producer, let's go back to this photograph number 6 one more time here, if we could. And just before we go to the break, ladies and gentlemen, I want you to notice these overlapping air defense identification zones, the one for China, the one for Japan. You'll see them in different colored lines there, and then towards the center of the picture you'll see, and I guess it's a very light color, the white line there is an air defense identification zone for Korea. And as we go to the break, I want you to remember a point that one of our guests, David Foust, has made here, that there is the very real possibility of an accident here, because this is a very crowded area for traffic. A lot of traffic, a lot of air traffic and ship traffic. And stay with us. You're watching Asian Review. We're talking about the reawakening of Japanese nationalism, and we'll see you on the other side of the break.
Aloha, I'm Nicole Horry for ThinkTech. For nearly half a century, the Hawaii Foreign Trade Zone No. 9 has brought the benefits of the Foreign Trade Zone program to Hawaii businesses and entrepreneurs. DBET, the Department of Business, Economic Development and Tourism, operates Hawaii's Foreign Trade Zone program to encourage international business and economic development. The Foreign Trade Zone's mission is to increase the amount of international trading activity in Hawaii, thereby providing employment opportunities for the residents of our island state, For more information, see ftz9.org. I'm Nicole Hori. Mahalo.
We're back. You're watching Asian Review, and we're talking about the reawakening of Japanese nationalism with Jeffrey Hornig, Professor Yuichiro Sato, and Professor David Foust. And I left out the professor for Jeffrey Hornig. You are a professor, but because your title is so long that we're going to drop that from now on.
That's fine.
Right. It's okay to have fun doing this, isn't it?
Exactly.
That's right. And you know, this is a pretty heavyweight intellectual group here. I feel dwarfed by the three of you here, but let me ask you, kind of throw out a very sensitive question on the table here. You know, as we look at Japan's post-war conduct, and we look at the rise of a global player economically, but Japan has been like a model global citizen, and it has adhered strictly to its constitution limiting its military to a defense posture. It's my view that nobody really takes seriously the notion of Japan as a military aggressor. I mean, that's going to require a major flip in psychology. And, you know, Yuichiro, maybe you can answer this question. Why is it that the Koreans and the Chinese can't seem to get over this 60-year-old history? Why is that?
Yeah.
From a Japanese perspective now.
Yeah.
I realize that the Koreans and Chinese will have their time on this show later.
Yeah, I think one of the issues is that the domestic politics requires kind of using legitimacy of being anti-Japanese.
You're talking about in Korea, the Korean mindset and the Chinese mindset.
Both in Korea and China. Being anti-Japanese is part of the identity, which has a broad appeal to the populations in both China and Korea. And in the Korea's case, it's even more difficult because you know, Korea didn't quite defeat Japan to end the war, and this is different from the case of China. You know, Mao can clearly claim that he defeated Japan. Also, you know, he and Chiang Kai-shek, you know, compete for the credit.
Okay.
But China as a whole can claim to have defeated Japan, but the Korea cannot, and that's sort of like a psychological trauma in a sense. And in the case of China, you know, the strong Chinese leader like Mao could forgive Japan. He was so strong domestically that he could forgive. But the weaker Chinese leaders in more recent periods cannot forgive, even though Mao once forgave it.
Wow.
Now the new leaders are going back to the, you know, old blaming mode again. And for Japanese, it's just utterly confusing. You know, what's happening in China?
Well, I suspect that Jeffrey and David would like to comment on this. Unfortunately, they're not going to get to because we're out of time here. And gentlemen, I'd like to thank you for Jeffrey Hornig, Yuichiro Sato, and David Foust. Thank you so much for taking time to join us with this program. We hope to have you again here with ThinkTech. You're watching Asian Review, and I'm David Day. Please have a safe drive home.